The carriage moved through Mayfair without lanterns. Augustus Blackwood had learned to travel without light 9 years ago. When light meant a target and a target meant a grave. Old habit. The kind that outlasted wars. That he checked his pocket watch without opening it. The weight told him enough. 10:30. The Hartsworth evening party would keep the family occupied until midnight at least. He had 90 minutes in the house before the carriages began returning. 90 minutes to find what he had come back to England to find. That he had not come back for the parties. He had not come back for the title. Though the War Office had returned it with the kind of formal letter that used the word distinguished 4 times and never once mentioned his father. He had not come back for the house in St. James that smelled of other people's furniture, or the seat in the Lords that had been empty for 9 years. While men who had arranged his father's death sat in the ones beside it. He had come back for a document. Specifically, for the original transcript of the 1806 court-martial proceedings against Edward Blackwood, Duke of Blackwood, on charges of passing military intelligence to agents of Napoleon Bonaparte, charges that had been constructed from the testimony of 2 witnesses, both of whom had since been given positions of considerable comfort within the Hartsworth commercial network. Augustus had known this for 3 years. He had spent those 3 years at Waterloo and in the months after, collecting the kind of evidence that could not be dismissed as the grievance of a bitter son. He had the witness statements, cross-referenced against the Hartsworth estate ledgers his contact in the city had quietly obtained. He had a letter, unsigned but in a hand he recognized, discussing the management of the Blackwood situation. What he did not have was the original transcript, the version that existed before it had been revised to reflect the court's eventual finding. That transcript was in the Hartsworth library. His contact had confirmed it 6 weeks ago. He had one night that he had been 17 when they had turned him away from the courtroom door. A footman, not even a family member, a footman had blocked the entrance and said, with the particular blankness of a man following instructions, that the proceedings were closed to members of the public. The public. His father had been inside, and Augustus had stood on the steps of the building in the November rain and listened to the sound of the city going about its business around him, and understood for the first time that the law was not a thing that protected people. It was a thing that certain people owned. He had been back to that building 4 times in the past year. Twice to submit formal petitions for review of the 1806 proceedings. Once to receive the response in sufficie. And grounds for reconsideration, matter considered closed. And once more, after Waterloo, with his campaign record and his new title and the kind of quiet certainty that 9 years of surviving things had given him, closed. They had said again, the matter is closed. He would open it himself. The carriage stopped 2 streets from the Hartsworth townhouse. Augustus descended without assistance, crossed through the mews behind the neighboring properties, and located the servants' entrance. He had spent the previous 3 weeks studying from a rented room across the road. The lock was the same model that had been fitted to the building in 1809. He had practiced on an identical one. He was inside in 40 seconds. The library was on the ground floor. East wing. He knew this because he had obtained the architectural plans from the surveyor's office on the pretense of inquiring about the property's structural history. He knew the library contained what he needed because the Hartsworth solicitor, in a moment of unguarded professional pride at a club dinner 6 months prior, had mentioned that the family maintained original copies of all proceedings in which they had participated. His word as a matter of thoroughness. Augustus had noted the word participated and said nothing. He moved through the ground floor without light, one hand tracing the wall at shoulder height. Past the drawing room. Past the morning room. Left at the end of the corridor, toward the east wing. He was passing the main staircase when he heard the voices. He stopped. 2 men, above him, on the first floor. The words were indistinct at this distance, but the tone was the particular combination of authority and reassurance that Augustus associated with doctors delivering news that was not, in fact, intended for the benefit of the patient. He should have continued to the library. He had 90 minutes and he did not know how many of them had passed. He went up the stairs. The voices came from behind a closed door at the end of the first floor corridor, one of the guest rooms. From the position, or a secondary bedroom. A line of candlelight showed beneath the door. Augustus positioned himself against the wall and listened. Recommend continued rest. The nervous temperament is not uncommon in young women of sensitive constitution. And the stimulation of the season has clearly. Naturally. Caspin Hartsworth. Augustus had heard that voice enough times across enough rooms to recognize it through a wall. We are in complete agreement. I have already arranged for Dr. Fun to visit on Thursday to discuss the longer-term management of the situation. In the meantime, Isabella. A pause. Then, quieter, the kind of quiet that was not gentle. You understand that your comfort is my primary concern. No response, the doctor's voice again, the scratch of a pen. More words that meant nothing. Complete rest, limited correspondence. Inadvisable to receive visitors. And then the sound of 2 sets of footsteps approaching the door. Augustus moved. He was through the nearest door, a dressing room, unlocked. Inhabited by the smell of cedar and old wool before the bedroom door opened. Through the gap he left between door and frame he watched Caspin Hartsworth walk past with a man carrying a medical bag. Talking in the low satisfied tones of a man whose arrangements had been confirmed. He watched the doctor leave. He watched Caspin return to the doorway, pause. And then with a kind of deliberate tenderness that was worse than anything else Augustus had seen in the last 3 minutes lean back into the room and say, "Good night." Isabella, the sound the lock made was very small. The kind of sound that was designed to be small. To be ordinary. To be the kind of sound that happened every night in houses like this and was simply the sound of a house settling. Augustus stood in the dressing room and counted his own heartbeat. To 20. Then he opened the door. The room was dark except for the window, where a remnant of moon provided enough light to see by if one's eyes had already adjusted. Augustus had. She was sitting upright in the bed, her back against the headboard. Her hair loose over her shoulders in the way that meant the lattice maid had already been and gone. She was not asleep. She had something in her hands, paper. A single folded sheet that she was holding at an angle to catch the thin light from the window. Her lips were moving without sound, she was memorizing it. Augustus took 1 step into the room. She looked up, she did not scream. She did not reach for anything. She looked at him with the focused tension of someone conducting a rapid assessment, and then something shifted in her expression, not fear, not relief, something more like the particular recognition of a person who has been expecting a variable they could not predict and has now identified it. "You're his son," she said. Her voice was very quiet, and entirely steady. The Duke of Blackwood. He said nothing. She looked at him for one more moment, long enough, he understood, to decide something, and then she folded the paper and slid it beneath her pillow. "You came for the library?" She said, "Yes." "Did you find what you needed?" "Not yet." She absorbed this. Outside, the street was quiet. The candlelight Caspin had left a single taper on the nightstand, burning low through more shadow than light. "The servants stare," she said. And her voice had shifted into something that Augustus recognized with a jolt of professional surprise, the flat, precise cadence of someone relaying operational information. "East side of the house. Behind the green baize door at the end of this corridor. 3rd step from the bottom is loose walk on the right edge. The library is at the end of the ground floor passage, last door on the left. The footman checks the ground floor at the hour. Not between. The housekeeper's room is opposite the head of the servants' stair. She is a light sleeper." Silence. "You have approximately 40 minutes before the family returns," she said. Augustus looked at her. She was sitting in a locked room in the house of the man who had locked her there. In the dark, with a document she had been memorizing hidden under her pillow, giving operational intelligence to a man who had broken in through the servants' entrance, with the composure of someone dictating correspondence. "Your name," he said. Something moved across her face, not surprise. Not quite. As though the question was not what she had expected, and she was deciding what to do with that. "Isabella," she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer than was necessary for either information transfer or social convention. Then he said, "He'll come back." He did not tell her his name. She already knew who he was. And something in the way she had said "you're his son," not as an accusation, not as a weapon, simply as a fact she was filing correctly, told him that she understood, without being told. That his name was not something he gave to people who lived inside Hartsworth houses that he found the servants' stair. The third step was loose, exactly as she had said. He walked on the right edge, behind him, on the first floor. A woman sat in a locked room in the dark and said nothing to anyone about the man who had just been in it. He thought about that. On the way to the library he thought about it more than he thought about the transcript. The transcript was not where his contact had said it would be. He spent 20 minutes in the library, working by the light of a hooded lantern no larger than his fist. The shelves were organized with the obsessive thoroughness of a family that considered documentation a form of power which, Augustus reflected, it was. Legal proceedings, estate records, parliamentary correspondence. All catalogued and dated in a clerk's careful hand. He found the Blackwood name twice, once in a record of property transfer dated 1807. And once in a ledger that appeared to track the distribution of former Blackwood estate revenues into the Hartsworth accounts. He stood with that ledger in his hands for a moment that he could not afford and did not take. The original transcript was not on the shelf where his contact had placed it. Either it had been moved, or his contact had been wrong, or, and this was the possibility he filed for later consideration, someone had moved it after his contact had looked. He replaced the ledger, extinguished the lantern, and left the library exactly as he had found it. He was back at the servants' stair when he stopped. He was not sure, afterward, why he stopped. The rational account that he was reassessing his exit route was true as far as it went. But it did not account for the fact that he stood on the bottom step of the servants' stair for approximately 15 seconds, looking up toward the first floor. Before he moved, he went back up. She was still awake. The taper had burned another quarter inch. She looked at him when he opened the door, and she did not look surprised that it wasn't there. He said, "No." She said. It wouldn't be. He looked at her. He moved the older proceedings to the private study 3 months ago. She said. After the Lords rejected your petition. A pause. I saw the boxes. The Lords' rejection had not been made public in any detail. It had been noted in the parliamentary record as a routine administrative decision. The fact that she knew it had been connected to him, and had connected it to the movement of documents in this house, meant that she had been paying attention in a way that people who locked their wives in rooms did not generally account for. The private study. He said, second floor. The room at the top of the main stair, the one with the green door. She paused. He keeps it locked. The key is on his watch chain. That's not accessible tonight. No, she agreed. It isn't. He should leave. The family would be returning within the hour. And he had found nothing. And standing in a locked bedroom in the Hartsworth townhouse was not a condition that would improve his position if discovered that he looked at the pillow. He had not asked. He had not asked because asking would make this into something other than what it currently was, an interrupted burglary, and a woman who had given him useful information and expected nothing in return. Asking would make it an exchange. He was not certain he was prepared for what he might be exchanging. The document you were memorizing. He said. Not a question. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached under the pillow and drew out the folded paper. She did not give it to him. She held it in both hands, looking at it. In the attitude of someone deciding something that could not be undecided. I found it in the correspondence files 4 months ago. She said. I've read it many times. She glanced up. I have a good memory. I noticed. The ghost of something, not quite a smile, crossed her face and was gone. They'll show you the first section, she said. Tonight. She unfolded the paper carefully, turned it toward the candlelight, and held it out far enough that he could read without taking it from her hands. The handwriting was Aldous Hartsworth's, Caspin's father. Dead 6 years. Augustus had seen enough of his correspondence through legal proceedings to recognize the hand. The date at the top was November 1806. The first paragraph discussed, in the careful language of a man who understood that documents outlasted intentions, the management of certain complications arising from the Blackwood proceedings. It referenced 2 individuals named only by initials who had provided testimony and required ongoing consideration in light of their continued cooperation. It was not, on its own, sufficient. But it was the beginning of a chain, and the beginning was what he needed to know existed. She refolded the paper. The rest, she said, he'll consider. He understood. She was not withholding from him, she was conducting the same calculation he would have conducted: what could be given, what needed to be kept, and what the cost of miscalculation might be. "He'll come back," he said again. Through the servants' stare. "At 11:30, when the household is settled." "Not Tuesday," she said. "He has people here on Tuesday evenings." Wednesday. She agreed. He moved toward the door. He had his hand on the frame when she spoke again. "Your coat," she said. "The buttons. Military issue, the Blackwood Regiment pattern. The housekeeper will know it if she sees it." He looked down at the buttons. Brass. His father's regiment. He had worn this coat for 9 years without thinking about it. "He'll change it," he said. She nodded. Already looking back toward the window, already somewhere else, or perhaps nowhere else, perhaps exactly here, in this room, with the document under her pillow and the lock on the door. Exactly where she had been before he arrived and would be after he left. He went down the servants' stair. Right edge on the 3rd step, outside. The street was still dark. His carriage was 2 streets away. He walked toward it with the particular quality of stillness that long campaigns produced, the ability to move through a space without disturbing it, without leaving evidence that you had been there. He had found nothing in the library. He had found something else entirely. He turned that thought over once, and then he put it away. Because there was no category in his current plans for what Isabella Hartsworth had been doing in that room tonight: memorizing a document she could not safely keep, filing intelligence about a house she could not safely leave, looking at a man who had broken into her prison and offering him, without being asked, the parts of the map she had already drawn. His plans would need a new category. He began constructing it on the walk back to the carriage. He came back on Wednesday. He had changed the coat. The buttons were plain horn now. The kind that suggested a country gentleman with no particular history. He had looked at the Blackwood brass for a long moment before he put the coat away, and then he had put it away. The 3rd step. The right edge. The corridor, the door. She was awake. Sitting at the small writing table beneath the window with a candle and what appeared to be household correspondence, the kind of letters a wife was permitted to manage, domestic accounts and social replies. She looked up when he entered. And her expression had the quality of someone resuming a conversation that had been interrupted rather than beginning a new one. He set a folder on the table beside her correspondence. "I need you to look at something," he said. She did not ask what it was. She moved the household letters to one side and opened the folder. Inside were 6 pages, a series of property transfer documents relating to the Hartsworth estate acquisitions between 1804 and 1810. Cross-referenced with a table of witness appearances in legal proceedings during the same period. Augustus had spent 3 days constructing this. The pattern was visible if you knew how to look for it, the same names appearing as witnesses in cases where Hartsworth interests were at stake. The same names receiving property consideration in the months following. He watched her read. She read the way his best intelligence officers had read, not linearly, but in passes, first for structure, then for detail. Her eyes moving in a pattern that suggested she was building a map rather than following one. Twice she paused and went back. Once she turned to the cross-reference table and held it beside the main document, comparing. "These 3, she said, pointing. "The signatures, what about them? They're not the same hand as the rest of the witness list." She turned the page toward him. "Look at the slope on the T. The others all lean the same way. These 3 lean back." She paused. "I've seen this hand before. In the household correspondence. Someone who writes for my husband when he doesn't want to write himself." Augustus looked at her. "His secretary," she said. "Mr. Fun. Not the doctor, a different Fun, a cousin." He had not known about the secretary. He had the property records and the witness list. But the connection between them, the specific hand that had manufactured the additional signatures, had been the gap he couldn't close. He wrote the name in his notebook without comment. She watched him write it. "The document under your pillow," he said. "You mentioned you'd consider the rest that I have," she said. She reached beneath the pillow and drew out the folded paper. This time she opened it fully and placed it on the table between them. He read, the second section detailed the arrangement made with the two primary witnesses in the Blackwood proceeding, not only the financial consideration, but the mechanism, how their original statements had been taken, how the revised versions had been substituted into the official record, and who within the court administration had facilitated the substitution. There was a name. A clerk. Now retired to a house in Shropshire that was considerably larger than a clerk's pension should have provided. The third section was shorter. 8 lines. It concerned correspondence with the Wycliffe School for Young Ladies in Derbyshire, and the instruction that letters addressed to or from a Miss Eliza Blackwood were to be held at the school's discretion rather than forwarded in the interest of the young lady's stability during a difficult family period. Augustus read those 8 lines twice. That he did not move. She was at Wycliffe, he said. The words came out with a flatness that was not calm. It was the sound of something becoming very still before it broke. Yes, Isabella said. She did not say anything else. That he put the document down on the table. He was aware that he was gripping the edge of the table and he released it. Eliza had been 14 when their father died. He had been at Wycliffe himself when the news came. And he had written to her every week for the first year, or he had believed he had, and she had believed she had, and neither of them had understood, in those years, why the letters came so rarely and said so little when they arrived. She had died at 19. Fever, they had said. The school had been very sorry. She wrote to me, he said. Not to Isabella, not really. I thought she stopped. I thought after a while she had. He stopped. Isabella waited. She did not offer him anything except the silence, and after a moment he understood that the silence was precisely what she was offering, not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understood that certain things did not require response. Only witness that he picked up the document again. Read the 8 lines again. Set it down. I'll need a copy, he said. That I know, she said. I've already made one. She opened the bottom drawer of the writing table and removed a second folded paper, identical in size to the first. Her handwriting. He recognized it from the household correspondence she had been managing when he arrived. He took it. He held it for a moment without looking at it. Your father taught you to copy documents. He said. That he taught me that original documents can be lost, she said, and that a copy in a different hand is not always the same as the original, but it is better than nothing. She paused. He was a court clerk. He had strong opinions about preservation. Augustus put the copy inside his coat, against his chest, in the pocket where he had once kept his field orders. Wednesday next, he said. Yes, she said. That he was at the door when she said, your coat is better. But the way you walk is still wrong for a tradesman. You hold your shoulders like someone who expects to be shot at. That he turned. She had already returned to her household correspondence. She did not look up. He left. The invitation to the Duke of Clarence's autumn reception arrived on a Tuesday. Augustus had been expecting it, had, in fact, arranged to be expecting it through the careful management of 3 separate social obligations over the preceding weeks. The reception was not the point. The point was that Caspin Hartsworth would be there. Because Caspin Hartsworth was always wherever there was proximity to the royal household, and because the reception would also be attended by Lord Carver, who sat on the Lords' Committee that had twice rejected the Blackwood petition, and who had accepted a gift of considerable land from the Hartsworth estate in 1809. That he arrived at precisely the right time, late enough to avoid the receiving line, early enough to position himself near the east salon where the serious conversations happened after the formal presentations concluded. He had worn a different coat. He had also, with considerable conscious effort, adjusted his shoulders. The rooms were everything these rooms always were. Too warm, too bright, the air heavy with candle smoke and the particular tension of people performing ease. Augustus moved through it with the fluency of someone who had learned, in 9 years of campaign dinners and regimental balls, to be present in a room without being visible in it. He saw her before he intended to. Isabella Hartsworth was standing 3 positions to the left of her husband, which was the precise position of a woman who had been placed rather than who had chosen her location. She was wearing grey, not the soft grey of fashion, but a silver gray that in the candlelight looked like something that had been very deliberately chosen to attract no attention whatsoever. Her hair was arranged with perfect correctness. She held a glass she had not drunk from. She looked like a painting of a woman at a party. Not the woman. The painting. Caspin was speaking with Lord Carver. The conversation had the animated quality of men discussing something they were pleased about. And Augustus filed that for later consideration that he did not look at Isabella again. He moved toward the east salon that he was intercepted twice, once by a general who wanted to discuss the Waterloo campaign and once by a baronet who wanted to discuss his horses, and extracted himself from both with th. Efficiency of long practice. In the east salon he found the conversation he had come for, three men discussing the proposed amendment to the land registration requirements, which would, if passed, make it considerably more difficult to obscure the kind of property transfers that Augustus had spent the last 3 days documenting. That he listened. He asked 2 questions. He established, through the medium of a conversation that appeared entirely social, that Lord Carver was not only opposed to the amendment but had been actively working to delay its committee reading, that he was leaving the east salon when he heard Caspin's voice, very close, and turned to find himself face to face with the man he had been watching from across rooms for the better part of 3 months. Caspin Hartsworth had the face of a man who had learned early that charm was a tool and had been using it so long he had ceased to notice it. He smiled with the particle warmth of someone who had already decided that you were not a threat. Blackwood, he said. A pleasure. I believe we have not been formally introduced since your return. No, Augustus said, your father would have been proud. Caspin said it with the ease of a man who had said it before, who knew it landed well, who had no idea Augustus was quite sure of this, that it landed the way it did. The family name restored. Waterloo. Quite remarkable, thank you, Augustus said. That he held the man's gaze for exactly as long as courtesy required. Not a moment longer. Across the room, Isabella was being introduced to someone, a general's wife. From the look of it, she was smiling at exactly the correct degree. Her glass was still full, their eyes did not meet. He was certain she had engineered this as carefully as he had done. He excused himself from Caspin with a pleasantry he did not track and moved toward the doors. His shoulders, he reminded himself, were wrong. He adjusted them. He came on Wednesday with a different kind of document, not evidence this time, or not only evidence. He had obtained, through a contact in the Office of Works, the original architectural survey of the Blackwood estate in Norfolk, the house, the grounds, the tenant farms, the mill on the eastern boundary that his father had built in 1798 and that had, according to the Hartsworth estate records, been demolished in 1812 to make room for a drainage project that appeared nowhere in the county records. That he had not intended to bring it. He had taken it from his desk that evening and stood with it in his hand for longer than was useful. And then he had put it inside his coat. That he set it on Isabella's writing table without explanation. She looked at it. She looked at him. You've been to Norfolk, she said. Last week. She unrolled the survey carefully, weighting the corners with the candlestick and her ink bottle and 2 small books from the shelf beside the table. She studied it in silence for a moment. The mill, she said, it's still standing. She looked up. Hartsworth told the estate trustees it was demolished. Augustus said. The demolition costs appear in the 1812 accounts, materials, labor, site clearance. The money left the estate. He paused. The mill is still standing. Someone is using it. The wheel was turning when I was there. Isabella was quiet for a moment, looking at the survey, the drainage project that doesn't exist in the county records, and the demolition costs that went somewhere. She sat back. She had the expression of someone assembling pieces that she had been holding separately for some time and was only now permitted to put together. There are 3 other properties, she said, in the estate accounts I've seen, described as disposals sold at below market value to cover maintenance costs, that are also in the accounts. She paused. I thought it was carelessness, or greed without sophistication. Another pause, shorter. It isn't careless. Is it? No, it's a system. Yes. She stood and went to the small bookshelf beside the window. She ran her finger along the spine's household manuals, a volume of sermons. 2 novels, and from behind the novels she withdrew a folded paper that was clearly not a novel and had been placed there with the specific intention of looking like it belonged. She brought it to the table and opened it. It was a list. Written in her hand. In the small precise script he had come to recognize dates in the left margin, property descriptions in the center, figures on the right. 23 entries spanning 8 years, I've been keeping this since April. She said. When I found the first document that he looked at the list. He looked at her. You've been building a case file, he said. I've been keeping records, she said. With a precision that was not modesty, it was accuracy. I didn't know what they were for. I knew they were the kind of thing that should be kept. That he thought of his father, who had also kept records. Who had brought those records to men he trusted and had not understood, until too late. The difference between a man who could be trusted and a man who appeared to be trustworthy. Your father taught you that too. He said that he taught me that a document without context is just paper. She said. He taught me that context is what you build around it. She smoothed the list on the table. I have 23 entries. You have the Norfolk survey and the witness signatures. Between us. Between us we have the shape of it. He said. She nodded. That he pulled his chair closer to the table. She moved the survey to make room for the list. For the next hour they worked in the particular silence of 2 people engaged in a shared task, in cross-referencing her entries against his own records. Her annotating the survey margins in the careful hand of someone who understood that margin notes were also evidence. At some point the candle burned low enough that she lit a second one without interrupting the work. At some point he moved from his side of the table to look at something she was pointing to, and did not move back. It was nearly 1 in the morning when he sat back and looked at what they had assembled. The third section of the document, he said. The one about Eliza. She had set the original letter aside when they began working. It was still there, folded. At the edge of the table. I've been thinking about how it connects, she said carefully. The school Wycliffe appears in the estate accounts. In 1807 and 1808. There are payments described as charitable educational endowments. She paused. The amounts are consistent with a board membership fee. He had suspected this. He had not known it. Aldous Hartsworth. He said. Caspin's father. He sat on the board from 1806 to 1809. She did not look at him while she said it. She kept her eyes on the list. The instruction about your sister's letters is dated October 1806. 3 months after your father's trial. 3 months after their father's trial. Eliza had been 14 and alone in Derbyshire and writing letters that went into a drawer in the school administrator's office and stayed there. Augustus said nothing for a moment. Then she would have written every week. She was very regular in things like that. He stopped. I wrote to her. I thought she had decided to manage on her own. She was always very determined about not needing things. He heard his own voice and stopped it. Isabella was still Lou King at the list. She turned it over, to the blank reverse, and picked up her pen. She wrote, Eliza. She wrote it in the same careful hand she wrote everything, not large, not decorated. Just the name, as a fact. As a record. Something that had existed and been taken from the record and was now being put back. She pushed the paper toward him. He looked at the name for a long moment. She wrote to you. Isabella said. You didn't receive the letters. That isn't the same as silence. She paused. That's the difference my father always said mattered between a record that was destroyed and a record that was hidden. Destroyed means it didn't happen. Hidden means it happened and someone didn't want it known. He picked up the paper. He folded it and put it in the same pocket where he kept her copy of the document. Against his chest. Where his field orders had been, the system. He said. His voice was level again. How many families? She turned back to the list. I know of 4 with certainty. There may be more. There are entries I haven't been able to identify yet. She ran her finger down the margin. Your family was the first. The largest. The one that established the pattern. Because my father had the most to take, because your father had the most to take, she agreed. And because he was also the most dangerous to leave intact. He had friends in the Lords. He had a record of speaking in committee on matters the Hartsworths needed managed. A pause. Disposing of him first was efficient, the words sat between them. I need access to the private study. Augustus said that I know, the transcript is the piece that makes everything else admissible. Without it, the rest is suggestive. She said. But not conclusive. She looked at the assembled documents on the table. I've been thinking about the key that he waited that he takes it off his chain when he changes for dinner, she said. It's set aside with his other effects pocket watch. Signet ring. His valet brings them back before he goes out. She paused. On the evenings he dines at the club. He leaves the house at 7. His valet sets out his things at 6 and collects them at past. There is 30 minutes when the key is in the dressing room and the valet has gone down to supper. Augustus looked at her. I can't go into the study myself, she said. With a flatness that acknowledged the reason without elaborating on it. He counts the things on his desk. I learned that early, but you know the window. I know every window in this house. She said. It's what you do when you can't use the doors. He made a note. She watched him write without commenting on it. Thursday, she said. He dines at the club on Thursdays. 6:15. The valet will be at supper by past. He closed his notebook. Isabella. He said. She looked up. It was the first time he had used her name directly, and they both registered it not with anything demonstrative, but with the particular quality of attention that meant it had been noted, what they did to your family. He said. Before. Your father. She was still for a moment. My father found an irregularity in a trust filing. She said. He reported it through the correct channels. 3 months later he was informed that his position was being eliminated as a cost-saving measure. A pause. He died the following year. He believed it was coincidence. Another pause. Shorter. I was less certain. That's why you kept the records. That's why I kept the records. She said. I didn't know who they were for. I knew they were the kind of thing that should exist. He stood. He gathered his documents with the efficiency of someone who had learned that time spent in places he was not supposed to be was a fixed resource. Thursday, he said. 6:15. Yes. She said that he was at the door. Augustus, she said that he turned. She had not used his name before either. The other families, she said. When this is done. They should know that he looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. They should that he went down the servants' stair. Third step. Right edge, outside, London was quiet in the way it was only quiet between 2 and 4 in the morning, not the quiet of sleep. But the quiet of the city briefly between one thing and the next. That he walked to his carriage with his shoulders wrong again and did not notice until he was already inside. Lady Montfort's Thursday afternoon reception was not the kind of event Augustus attended by preference. It was, however, the kind of event that Isabella Hartsworth was required to attend, and that Caspin Hartsworth considered beneath his time. And that therefore provided one of the few circumstances in which she existed in a room without him. Augustus arrived 12 minutes after the posted start time and found the drawing room at 3/4 capacity, the usual assembly of wives and daughters and the particular category of older woman, who had accumulated enough social authority to attend these things on her own terms. Lord Montfort was not present. Lord Montfort was never present at his wife's Thursday receptions, which was, Augustus suspected, a domestic arrangement of long-standing and mutual satisfaction. That he found a position near the windows where he could observe the room without appearing to observe it. He had been doing this at parties for 9 years and had become very good at it. Isabella was in the far corner, seated beside a woman in purple whom he did not immediately recognize. She was holding a cup she was not drinking from. She was listening to the woman in purple with the quality of attention that he had come to understand was her default register, fully present, filing everything, giving nothing away. The woman in purple was Lady Grantham. He placed her after a moment, widow of Sir Edmund Grantham, former trustee of the Merchant Sailors' Pension Fund, which had lost a considerable portion of its holdings in 1811 in circumstances that had been officially attributed to poor investment management and had not been officially attributed to the fact that those holdings had passed through a Hartsworth commercial vehicle on their way to disappearing. He moved to a position closer to the corner. Not close enough to join, close enough to hear. He caught the last portion of what Isabella was saying. Naturally, the specific terms vary by instrument. But if I were considering any arrangement of that kind, I would want to see 5 years of independently verified accounts before committing. She paused. My father felt very strongly that the value of independent verification was precisely that it removed the question of trust from the arrangement entirely. Trust is a social matter. Accounts are a factua. L1. Lady Grantham looked at her with the expression of someone who had just heard something they had been thinking for years stated plainly for the first time. Your father was a professional man? Lady Grantham said. A court clerk. Isabella said. He had strong opinions about documentation. It sounds as though his opinions were worth having. I've found them useful. Isabella said. Augustus turned away from the window and moved toward the refreshment table. He did not look at Isabella. She did not look at him. 3 minutes later, Lady Grantham touched the sleeve of the woman beside her and said something in a low voice, and the woman beside her nodded. And both of them looked at the middle distance with the expressions of people who have just decided something. He took a cup of tea he did not drink and stationed himself near the door. When Isabella passed him on her way to speak to Lady Montfort, she did not pause, did not look at him, did not alter her trajectory by a fraction, but as she passed, she said, very quietly, the words timed precisely to the gap between two nearby conversations. She lost £400 in the 1811 fund collapse. She's been looking for somewhere to put the question for 2 years. She was gone before he could respond. He looked at Lady Grantham across the room, who was now speaking with animation to a third woman. Her purple sleeves catching the afternoon light. He drank some of the tea. It occurred to him that Isabella Hartsworth had just, in the space of a 7-minute conversation at a Thursday afternoon reception, planted the beginning of a question that Lady Grantham had been carrying for 2 years and not known how to put down. He had spent 9 years learning how to move through rooms without being seen. She had spent considerably less time learning how to be seen in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment. He thought, not for the first time, that her father had taught her very well. He obtained the transcript on a Thursday. The private study was smaller than he had expected, a working room rather than a ceremonial one, shelved on 3 sides. The desk positioned to face the door. A man who liked to see what was coming. He found the transcript in the 3rd cabinet, in a folder marked with the year and a case reference number that meant nothing without the index, which was in a separate drawer. Aldous Hartsworth had been thorough. Caspin had maintained the system without, apparently, understanding why his father had built it. The index was updated in a different hand, less careful, suggesting someone following instructions rather than someone who had designed them. Augustus photographed nothing. He had no mechanism for photography. He read the original transcript and then he read the revised version, which was filed directly behind it, whether from carelessness or the particular arrogance of a family that had never expected the cabinet to be opened by anyone other than themselves. He could not determine. He read both versions with the full attention of a man who had been waiting 9 years to read them. And when he was finished he sat for a moment in the chair of the man who had arranged his father's death and breathed. Then he made notes in the small precise hand he had developed in the field, replaced both documents in the exact configuration he had found them, relocked the cabinet, and left. He came that night earlier than usual. Isabella heard the 3rd step and looked up from her writing table before he opened the door. She had learned the sound of his particular weight on that step, lighter on the right edge than a heavier man would be, quicker than someone uncertain of their footing. He looked different. She had catalogued his expressions over the preceding weeks with the same attention she gave to everything, not from sentiment, but because she had learned early that expressions were data, and that men who believed their faces were neutral were frequently wrong. He had a face that he controlled carefully, and she had learned to read what he controlled for. Tonight he looked like a man who had found what he came for and had not yet decided what to do with that. He sat down. He set his notebook on the table. He did not open it immediately. The transcript exists. He said. I know, both versions. filed together. A pause. Caspin's father kept the original. I don't know if Caspin knows it's there or if he simply inherited a cabinet he doesn't fully understand, that he inherited a great deal he doesn't fully understand. She said. Augustus looked at her. He maintains the forms, she said. The accounts, the correspondence systems. She stopped. He knows the shape of what his father built. I don't think he knows all of its contents. A pause. He's never mentioned your sister to me. I don't think he knows about the school arrangement. I think it was his father's caution, not his. This was, Augustus had come to understand, the particular quality of intelligence that Isabella generated, not only what she knew, but what she had inferred from the texture of what she lived inside. She had spent months in proximity to Caspin Hartsworth and had constructed a model of him that was, Augustus suspected, more accurate than anything his own investigations had produced. I want to show you something, he said. He opened the notebook to the page where he had recorded the key discrepancies between the original transcript and the revised version, the specific substitutions, the lines that had been altered, the testimony that had been reconstructed to support a finding of guilt. She read it the way she read everything, in passes, building context. But midway through the second pass she stopped, and went back to one entry, and her hand, which had been resting flat on the table, closed slowly into a stillness that was different from her usual stillness. This witness, she said. She pointed to an initial in his notes, RF. His revised testimony places your father at a meeting on the 14th of March 1806. Yes, the original testimony places him at his estate in Norfolk on the 14th of March. She looked up. My father notarized a property survey for the Blah. Quoud Norfolk estate on the 14th of March 1806. I know this because I helped him carry the survey documents to the client's agent. I was 11 years old. I remember it because it was the first time he let me come to the office. A pause. Your father was in Norfolk. My father can confirm he was in Norfolk. My father is dead. Another pause. But the notarization record is in the court clerk's archive. It has a date and a signature and a client name. Augustus was very still. Your father, he said slowly, was the clerk assigned to the Blackwood estate that quarter. She said. Yes. He looked at his notes. He looked at her. You didn't know this, he said. It was not a question, but it required confirmation that I didn't know the specific date mattered, she said. I knew my father had worked for your family. It was a standard client assignment. He had several in Norfolk, but I didn't know the trial rested on the 14th of March. She met his gaze steadily. I know now, something was happening in Augustus that he did not have a category for. He had come into this house 7 weeks ago looking for a transcript, and he had found it. And it was sufficient. The original testimony against the revised version was sufficient, with the witness signatures and Isabella's property list and Lady Grantham's eventual corroboration, to bring a case before the Lords that could not be dismissed a third time. And now there was a notarization record in a court archive that placed his father in Norfolk on the date the revised testimony claimed he was in London, and the man who had notarized it had been Isabella's father. And Isabella's father had been dismissed from his position and had died the following year, and his daughter had been married to the man whose family had arranged all of it. Isabella, he said. I know, she said, very quietly. He did not know, precisely, what she meant by I know. He thought she meant, I have already understood what this means and I have already decided what I am going to do about it. He thought she meant, do not treat this as a thing that requires careful handling. Because I am not a thing that requires careful handling. He thought she might also mean, I am aware that this is the moment where the architecture of everything becomes visible and I would like a moment to look at it. He gave her the moment. Outside, a carriage passed. The candle moved in the draught from the window, and the shadows shifted and settled. The archive, he said. The notarization record is a public document, she said. Accessible to any person with a legitimate interest in the proceedings. She paused. A son seeking to clear his father's name has a legitimate interest that a widow's testimony about her late husband's professional records is admissible as corroborating evidence under the 1798 Civil Procedure G. Yudlines, she said, with the flatness of someone who had looked this up, provided the records themselves are produced as primary evidence that he looked at her. My father had strong opinions about procedure. She said. I paid attention that he sat back. He put his hand over his mouth for a moment not to conceal an expression. But in the manner of someone whose thinking had outrun his face and required a brief interval to catch up. His father had been in Norfolk. Her father had been there to witness it. Both of their fathers were dead. But the record existed, in a public archive. In the careful hand of a court clerk who had done his job correctly on the 14th of March 1806, and no one had thought to destroy it because no one had known it mattered, until now. There is one more thing. Isabella said that he waited. She opened the bottom drawer of the writing table, not the folder where she kept the list, a different drawer, one he had not seen her open before. She removed a small notebook, cloth-covered, the kind used for personal accounts. My father kept this. She said. I didn't understand why he kept it separate from his professional records until I read it again last month. She set it on the table. He recorded, in his personal accounts, every client visit. Not the professional details, those were in the office ledgers. Just the date, the client name. And one or two words about the nature of the visit. She opened it to a page marked with a folded slip of paper. 14th of March, 1806. Blackwood, Norfolk. Survey. Property boundaries. Client present throughout. 4 words. Client present throughout. A court clerk's habit, the kind of notation that meant nothing except to the clerk who made it, a private record of a professional day. Kept in a personal notebook that had survived because it was personal rather than professional and therefore had not been collected when his position was eliminated and his files were cleared. Client present throughout. Augustus read the 4 words 3 times. That he thought of his father. Who had kept records? Who had brought those records to men he trusted? Who had stood in a courtroom while 2 men said things that were not true? And had been unable to prove it. He had been in Norfolk. There was a man who had seen him there. The man was dead. But he had written it down. He looked up. Isabella was watching him with the expression she sometimes had when she was letting him have a moment, not intruding, not looking away. Just present. Your father wrote it down. He said that he always wrote things down, she said. He said that memory was personal and therefore arguable, but a record made at the time was neither. Augustus' hand was on the notebook. He had not taken it, just set his hand beside it. The way he sometimes set his hand on maps in the field, not grasping. Just maintaining contact with something that was real. He thought about what it had cost her father to keep this notebook. He thought about what it had cost her to carry it through a marriage she had not chosen, into a house she could not leave, and keep it in a locked drawer beside a list she had been building since April. Isabella, he said. She looked at him. He did not say thank you. The words were inadequate in a way that would have been insulting to both of them. He did not say your father was a good man, because she knew that, and it was not what the moment required. He said. When this is finished, the committee, the formal review, all of it, I want to make sure your father's contribution to the record is part of the official account. His name. The notarization. What he found and what it cost him. She was very still. He deserves to be in the record. Augustus said. Not as a footnote. As part of the case. Something moved across her face, not the almost smile he had seen before, something quieter and more permanent. He would have found that appropriate, she said finally. He had strong opinions about records. I know. Augustus said. You've mentioned it. She looked at him for a moment, and this time the almost smile made it all the way. He picked up his notebook. He did not pick up the cloth-covered account book that stayed with her, where it was safe. You'll need a copy of the relevant page. He said. I've already made one, she said. Of course she had. The Ashworth Musicale was held on a Friday evening in a house on Grosvenor Square that had better acoustics than most concert halls and worse canapes than most taverns. Augustus attended because Lord Carver attended. And because there was a particular interval between the second and third pieces when the guests moved from the main salon to the adjoining library for refreshments. And the library connected to a small sitting room where conversations of a more private nature occasionally occurred. He was not expecting to find Isabella alone in the library. she was not precisely alone. There were 6 other people in the room, but she was standing near the far bookshelf in the manner of someone who had positioned herself at a slight remove from the nearest conversation. And she appeared to be examining the spines of the books with an attention that was probably not entirely genuine. That he moved to the bookshelf on the adjacent wall. For a moment neither of them spoke. The nearest conversation, 2 men discussing a bill before the Commons provided adequate cover. Ca. Brewer arrived with Caspin, she said. To the bookshelf. Her voice was pitched for him and no further. I saw, they were speaking about the committee reading. I couldn't hear the substance. A pause. Caspin was pleased. Augustus considered this. The committee reading for the petition review was scheduled for the following month. Caspin's pleasure could mean any number of things, few of them useful. Lady Grantham, he said, to his own section of bookshelf. Has she? She's written to 2 other women from the pension fund collapse. Isabella said. I know because she told me at Lady Montfort's last week. She described it as a private inquiry she was conducting. She used the words independent verification. That he had not taught her that phrase. She had used it herself, at the Thursday reception. And Lady Grantham had carried it home. Shall want someone to bring the inquiry formally, he said. Shall want someone to tell her it's possible, Isabella said. She doesn't know yet that it is, and if she knew. A brief pause. She has a solicitor she trusts. He was not involved in the fund arrangements. She mentioned him at Lady Montfort's in the same breath as independent verification. Another pause. I don't think that was coincidence that he looked at the books in front of him without seeing them. Lady Grant. Ham's solicitor. The pension fund records. The Hartsworth commercial vehicle through which the fund's holdings had been passed. That he thought of the list on Isabella's writing table. 23 entries. For families he could name with certainty. The committee reading. He said. If Carver moves to delay it again. He won't, she said. Not if Lady Grantham's solicitor files a related inquiry in the same session. Carver won't want 2 things on the record at once. That he turned his head slightly. She was still looking at the bookshelf, her face in profile. Entirely composed. You've thought about this, he said. That I think about most things, she said. It's what you do when you can't do much else. The music started again in the next room, the 3rd piece, which meant the interval was ending. Around them. People began moving back toward the salon. My father said, she said, very quietly, as the room began to empty. That the most important skill a clerk could have was understanding which pieces of information belonged together even when they were filed separately. She paused. He said the filing system was always someone's choice. Which meant it could always be reorganized. She moved away from the bookshelf. Back toward the salon, with the unhurried ease of someone who had been looking at books and was now going to listen to music. That he stayed where he was for a moment, then he followed, at the appropriate interval, and found his seat 3 rows behind Lord Carver. And listened to the remainder of the concert with the quality of attention he gave to terrain before a campaign, cataloging, assessing, filing, reorganizing. She had not intended to be alone in the garden. The Hartsworth townhouse had a walled garden at the rear, not large. Not particularly well maintained. The kind of space that existed because houses of this type were expected to have one rather than because anyone used it. Isabella had discovered in her first weeks here that it was the one place in the house where she could walk without passing through a room that contained either Caspin or someone. Reporting to Caspin. She came here in the late afternoons when the light was going and the garden was too cold for anyone to think of looking for her there. She had been here for 20 minutes when she heard the door. She did not turn immediately. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path on her. Read, the particular rhythm of a man who had decided to be leisurely, and she turned only when he was close enough that not turning would have been a statement. Caspin looked well. He always looked well. It was one of the things she had noticed first about him. Before she understood what the looking well was in service of Isabella. He smiled. I didn't know you favored the garden. That I find it useful, she said. That he came to stand beside her, looking at the wall at the far end of the garden as though it had something to recommend it. This was his social manner, the assumption of shared perspective, the positioning of himself as a companion in whatever you were already doing. So that his presence felt invited rather than imposed, she had learned to recognize this. It had taken her 3 weeks after the wedding. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said. "About the winter arrangements. Dr. Van Fiels and I agree. Naturally that the country would be beneficial. The air. The quiet. A pause. Thornfield is comfortable in winter. Mrs. Harker has kept it well." Thornfield was the Hartsworth property in Wiltshire. It was 40 miles from London and had, as far as Isabella had been able to determine, no particular social connection to anyone whose assistance she might require. "That I appreciate your concern," she said. Her voice was level. "I should like, before any arrangements are made, to ask you about something." That he looked at her with the mild inquiry of a man who expected to be asked something manageable. "The committee reading," she said. "For the Blackwood petition. I understand it's scheduled for next month." The quality of his attention changed. Not visibly, he was too careful for visible. But she had spent 8 months learning the specific texture of his stillness. And this stillness was different from the one before it. "Where did you hear about the petition?" he said. Pleasantly. "Lady Montfort mentioned it," she said. "In passing. I didn't attend to the details." She kept her voice precisely in the register of a woman relaying social information of no particular importance. "I only ask because I believe the Blackwood family's legal connection touched on some of my father's professional work. And I wanted to ensure that if there were any questions about the court records from that period, there would be someone who could speak to their accuracy." A silence. "Your father's work," Caspin said. "That he was a court clerk," she said. "He had a number of clients in Norfolk. It's possible some of his records might be relevant." She met his eyes with the expression of a woman discussing administrative trivialities. "I wouldn't want there to be any confusion about the completeness of the archive." She watched him decide. She had learned to see the moment when he was deciding, a small contraction around the eyes, a fraction of a pause longer than social convention required. "That I wasn't aware your father had any connection to the Blackwood estate," he said. "That a minor one," she said. "Quite routine. I only mention it because I know how particular you are about thorough documentation." She let the words sit for precisely the right interval. "Your father was known for his thoroughness. I imagine you've maintained that standard." Another silence. "Longer." "It's thoughtful of why." "Oh, you to consider it," he said, finally. "I'll look into whether any such records are relevant." "Of course," she said. "I'm sure it's nothing." She turned back to the wall. He stood beside her for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to say something further. And then deciding not to. And then she heard his footsteps on the gravel, unhurried, back toward the house. When she was certain he was gone, she let out a breath, slowly, through her nose. The way her father had taught her to manage the interval between a question asked and an answer received, she had not accused him of anything. She had not revealed anything he had not already known she might know. She had asked a question that could not be answered with "That information doesn't exist," because the information did exist, and they both knew it existed, and now he knew that she knew it existed, and he did not know how much else she knew. She had told Augustus she had done it when he came that Wednesday, and he had been very still for a moment, and then he had said, "That was a risk." "Yes," she had said. "Hell move faster now." "On Thornfield, or something else." "Yes," she had said. "So will we." She stood in the cold garden until her fingers were numb. And then she went inside. The hearing room in the Lords' Committee building was smaller than Augustus had expected. He had been in this building twice before, once at 17, turned away at the door, and once the previous year, when the petition had been declined without full hearing. He knew the corridors, the high ceilings, the smell of cold stone and old paper. That was the particular atmosphere of places where power arranged itself into procedure. The room had 12 seats at the main table, currently occupied by 8 committee members and 4 clerks. There were chairs along the walls for observers, barristers, clerks, interested parties. The gallery above was half full. Lord Carver was in the 3rd seat from the left. He had the expression of a man who had attended many of these proceedings and had long ago stopped expecting them to produce anything he hadn't already arranged. Augustus Barrister, Mr. Prentice, was a man recommended by 3 separate sources for the specific quality of not being managed. He was 54, precise, and had the manner of someone who had spent 3 decades refusing to be impressed by anything. Augustus had found him reassuring. The petition was introduced at 10 o'clock. The grounds: newly discovered evidence relevant to the 1806 proceedings against Edward Blackwood, 1st Duke of Blackwood, including original documentation demonstrating material discrepancy between testimony as entered into the court record and testimony as originally given. Lord Carver's expression did not change. Prentice presented the first document, the original transcript, obtained, he stated, with the precise wording Augustus had provided from the Hartsworth Private Archive, produced by a party with direct knowledge of its location and the legal standing to attest to its provenance. The committee chairman, Lord Ashby, looked up. What party? The documentation will be addressed in full when we reach the question of provenance, my lord, Prentice said. I ask the committee's patience. Carver's counsel, a man named Whitmore who had the look of someone perpetually braced for something, made a note. The second document, the revised transcript, also from the Hartsworth Archive, filed directly behind the original in the same cabinet. The discrepancies between the 2 versions were read into the record. The committee sat in the particular silence of people encountering something they had not expected to encounter. Carver said something quietly to Whitmore, the third docum. Ent. The cross-referenced property records linking the 2 witnesses R.F. and J.M. to Hartsworth estate transactions occurring within 6 months of the 1806 proceedings. Dates, figures, names. The fourth document, the notarization record from the court clerk's archive. 14th of March. 1806, Blackwood, Norfolk. Survey, property boundaries. The name of the notarizing clerk. The official seal of the court archive. Prentice set this document on the table with the quietness of a man who understood that the important things did not need to be announced. The 14th of March 1806. He said, is the date on which the revised testimony places the 1st Duke of Blackwood in London, at a meeting which the prosecution presented as evidence of his contact with French agents. The original testimony, before revision, made no such claim. The court archive record confirms that on this date, the 1st Duke of Blackwood was present at his Norfolk estate for a routine property survey, and was observed to be present throughout by the attending court clerk. Lord Carver's expression had not changed, but he had stopped looking at the documents and was looking at the wall above the committee table, and Augustus, who had spent 9 years learning to read stillness. Read this one. Whitmore rose. My lords, the question of document provenance, a transcript removed from a private archive without the knowledge or consent of the archive's owner. The question of provenance, Prentice said, without rising, will be addressed by the next witness. A door at the side of the room opened. Isabella walked in. She was wearing dark blue, not the gray she wore to disappear, not the silver she wore to events. Dark blue. The color of someone who had decided to be seen. Her hair was dressed simply. She carried nothing. Augustus had known she was coming. He had not known how she would look when she walked through that door, and he found, watching her cross the room to the witness position, that he had not adequately prepared for it. She had told him, on the Wednesday before, I am going to attend. Not I want to attend, or do you think I should attend? A statement of fact, delivered in the flat precise voice she used for things that had been decided. He had said. Caspin will contest it. He can contest the testimony of his own wife on matters relating to documents she personally handled in her capacity as a member of his household. She said. That is his right. I imagine the committee will find it instructive. He had looked at her. I am the wife of a Hartsworth, she had said. Currently. That is not, this week. A disadvantage. She had been right. It was not. She stood at the witness position and stated her name and her relationship to the Hartsworth household and her reason for appearing, the latter in the words she had rehearsed. In the flat precise cadence of a woman making a legal record rather than a personal statement, that she had discovered the original document in the household correspondence files, that she had recognized its relevance to proceedings of public record. and that she was appearing to attest to its authenticity and to the circumstances of its discovery. Whitmore rose again. My lords, the competence of this witness to testify in matters relating to. The witness is a member of the Hartsworth household and has direct personal knowledge of the documents in question. The committee chairman said. Objection noted. Proceed. Caspin was in the gallery. Augustus had not looked directly at him, but he knew the position third row, left side because he had identified it when he entered and had maintained peripheral awareness as a matter of practice. He was aware, now, that Caspin had gone still in the way of a man who had made a calculation and found it returning an answer he had not expected. The committee heard Isabella's testimony. She was precise. She was economical. She stated what she had found, where she had found it, when she had found it, and what she understood it to signify. She did not editorialize. She did not gesture toward anything she could not directly attest to. When Whitmore cross-examined and suggested that her understanding of the document's significance might have been influenced by her husband's enemy, she said, with the quality of someone pointing out a self-evident fact, my understanding of the document's significance came from reading them. They are not difficult to interpret. Point 2 of the committee members exchanged a look. The fifth document, Lady Grantham's submission, entered through her solicitor, attesting to the Hartsworth commercial vehicle's role in the 1811 pension fund collapse and requesting that it be considered as contextual evidence of a pattern of conduct that it was not, technically, part of the Blackwood petition. It was a separate submission, formally filed 3 days prior, relating to a separate matter. It was, however, in the same session, and Lord Ashby had agreed with the equanimity of a man who found procedural confluences interesting to receive it. Carver turned his head. He looked, for a long moment, at Caspin in the gallery. Caspin looked back. That it was the look of two men who have been relying on an architecture that is developing an unexpected structural problem and have not yet agreed on who is responsible. Augustus watched this and filed it. Prentice made his closing submission. The discrepancy between the original and revised transcripts was, he argued, not a matter of interpretation, it was a matter of record, demonstrable through the documents themselves. The notarization from the court archive placed the first Duke of Blackwood in Norfolk on the day the revised testimony claimed he was in London. The revised testimony had been entered into the record of proceedings as original testimony. This was either an error or a deliberate act. If the committee required assistance in determining which, Prentice would be delighted to direct their attention to the property records filed as Exhibit 4. The committee retired. They returned in 40 minutes. Lord Ashby read the finding in the measured tone of a man for whom language was a professional instrument. The committee found sufficient grounds to recommend a formal review of the 1806 proceedings, with particular attention to the discrepancy in witness testimony and the documentary evidence of the first Duke's presence in Norfolk on the date in question. The review would be referred to the full Lords for scheduling. That it was not, Augustus knew, a complete exoneration. It was a door, but it was a door that had been closed for 9 years. And it was open. He was aware of Isabella across the room. She had returned to her seat along the wall when her testimony concluded and had sat through the remainder of the hearing with the stillness of a person who has done what they came to do and is now simply present. He did not look at her. He did not look at him. They had agreed on this. That he looked at Lord Carver, who was gathering his papers with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had a great deal to do and had just had his schedule rearranged. That he looked at Caspin in the gallery, who was looking at Isabella, and whose face had the particular quality of a man recalculating. That he looked at the committee table, where the original transcript of his father's proceedings was now part of the formal record, not a document in a locked cabinet in a private study, but a document that had been read into the record and could not be unread. That he thought of his father on the steps of this building, 19 years ago. He thought of himself on the steps of this building at 17, turned away at the door. He thought of Eliza at Wycliffe, writing letters that went into a drawer. He thought of Isabella, walking through that side door in dark blue, carrying nothing except what she knew. That he had come to London 9 years after his father's death to find a transcript. He had found it. He had also found what the transcript connected to, and what that connected to, and what all of it, in the end, had cost not only his family, but hers, and 4 others. And Lady Grantham's 300 sailors who had expected a pension and received instead a letter of regret. The hearing room was emptying around him. Prentice was speaking to him something about next steps, the formal review timeline. The question of the Wiltshire property and whether Isabella had arrangements in place. Augustus answered appropriately. He thought that he was watching the door through which Isabella had left, that he had a new category now. He thought. He had been constructing it since the night he walked out of a dressing room and found her in the dark, memorizing a document she couldn't safely keep. He had been adding to it on every Wednesday night since, on every afternoon reception. On every moment in every room where they had not looked at each other and had understood each other precisely. That it was not a category that had a name in military planning. It was not a category that had been in his plans 9 years ago, or 7 weeks ago. Or even 3 weeks ago, when he had first admitted to himself that he was spending more time thinking about what she had said than about what it meant for the case. That he picked up his hat, that he went out through the main doors, into the November air. And stood on the steps where he had stood at 17 with the rain coming down and the sound of the city going about its business. The city was still going about its business. That he breathed. The Blackwood house in Norfolk had been empty for 9 years, not entirely empty. The Hartsworths had used it for 2 seasons before determining it was too far from London to be convenient, and after that it had been maintained by a skeleton staff whose wages appeared, Augustus had noted, nowhere in the Hartsworth estate accounts. He did not inquire too closely into how the staff had managed. He thought perhaps they had simply stayed because it was their home and they had not been told otherwise. And that this was the kind of thing that happened in houses when the people who owned them on paper stopped paying attention. That he had ridden out 3 days after the hearing. Alone. He had told Prentice he needed to inspect the property before the formal restoration proceedings began. Which was true, and he had told himself he needed a day away from London, which was also true, and he had not told himself the third thing, which was that he needed to stand in his father's house before anyone else arrived to tell him what it meant. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, who had been there since before Augustus was born, had opened the door and looked at him for a long moment and then said, in the tone of a woman who had been waiting to say it for 9 years, "Your father's study is as he left it." I've kept it. That he had stood in the doorway of his father's study for a while. The desk was clear. His father had kept a clear desk. On the windowsill there was a small carved wooden horse that Augustus recognized. He had given it to his father when he was 7. Produced with great seriousness as a birthday gift, and his father had placed it on the windowsill and it had stayed there. He had not known, until this moment, that he had been wondering for 9 years whether it was still there. It was still there. He sat down at his father's desk and looked out the window at the grounds, which were overgrown in the particular way of places that had been cared for until they weren't. And thought about what came next with the precision of a man who had learned to think clearly in uncomfortable positions. What came next was the formal review. Prentice had given him a timeline, 3 months. Perhaps 4. The review would examine the 1806 proceedings and issue a finding. If the finding supported the petition and Prentice's assessment, delivered with the careful optimism of a man who did not promise things, was that it would the attainder would be reversed and the Blackwood estate would be formally restored. What came next was also the question of Isabella. She had left the Hartsworth townhouse 3 days before the hearing. He had not arranged this. She had arranged it herself. With the same quiet efficiency with which she arranged everything. She had sent him a note, 2 lines, in her small precise hand. "I have removed to my cousin's house in Kensington. The documents are with me. I am available to consult as needed. As needed." As though she had drafted it for a professional correspondence file. He had read the note 3 times and then put it in the same pocket where he kept the copy of the docum. And she had made for him on the 2nd Wednesday. He had not yet gone to Kensington. He had told himself this was because the hearing required his full attention, which was true. He had told himself that the question of what happened after the hearing could wait until after the hearing, which was also true. He was less certain about the third reason, which had something to do with the fact that he had been thinking about Isabella Hartsworth in terms of strategy and evidence and mutual interest for 7 weeks, and he was not sure he knew how to think about her in any other terms. And he was not sure, and this was the part that required sitting at his father's desk and looking at the overgrown grounds, whether she wanted him to. He rode back to London the following morning. She was in Kensington, in a narrow house that belonged to a cousin who was currently in Bath and had, from the evidence, not redecorated since approximately 1790. The sitting room had green wallpaper and too many small tables, and the particular quality of a room that had been arranged once and then never adjusted. Isabella was at the writing table. Of course she was at the writing table with papers arranged before her in the configuration he had come to recognize as her working order, primary documents on the left, notes in the center, reference materials to the right. She looked up when he was shown in, and her expression had the quality of someone resuming a conversation. The review timeline, she said. Prentice wrote 3 to 4 months, he said. He sat down across from her. It was the first time they had been in the same room in daylight, at a reasonable hour, without the necessity of whispered voices and the constant awareness of the servant's stare. It was a different quality of being in the same room. The other families, she said. I've been writing to their solicitors. With your permission, I've used your name as the originating party. Since the petition establishes the precedent, you don't need my permission that I used your name, she said, with precision. That requires your permission. That he looked at her. Then you have it. She made a note. He watched her make the note, the small precise hand, the particular angle at which she held the pen, the way she set it down when she was finished, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. There is one other matter, she said. She did not look up immediately, which he noted, because she almost always looked up. The marriage. He said. She looked up. I've spoken to Prentice about the separation proceedings, he said. Given the circumstances, the documentation of the household confinement, the medical instructions, the pattern of conduct that the pension fund submission helps to establish, he believes the grounds are strong. That I know, she said. I've also spoken to Prentice. A pause. He said the same things to me that he said to you, I imagine. With the addition of a strong recommendation that I secure independent counsel. Have you? I have. A woman my father knew. She's been practicing for 20 years and has a particular interest in domestic property cases. She paused. She had opinions about my situation. That I imagine she did. Something that was not quite the almost smile moved across her face. She used the word actionable. Seve. Ral times. I found it reassuring that he looked at his hands for a moment. He had been thinking about how to say the next thing since Norfolk, and he had not, in 2 days of thinking, arrived at a formulation that satisfied him. He decided to say it without a formulation. That I came to London to find a transcript, he said. That was 9 years of intention concentrated into one specific object. He paused. I found the transcript. I also found everything it connected to. And everything that connected to, and somewhere in that process I found that I had constructed a new category in my planning that did not have a name, and that was specifically about you. She was very still. That I am not, he said, practiced at this kind of statement. I have been told that I speak as though I am writing field orders, which is accurate, and I have not found a way to correct it. He met her eyes. What I mean is that the work we have done together is the most important work I have done since the war. And that is true for reasons that are about the work, but it is also true for reasons that are about the person I was doing it with. And I would like, if you are willing, to continue not only the work with the other families, and the review, and the archive questions, which I would like to continue regardless, but the other thing. The category that doesn't have a name. Silence. Outside, a cart was passing in the street. The green wallpaper absorbed the light in a way that made the room feel smaller than it was. You speak exactly like field orders, she said. That I know that it is, in its way, very clear. That I hoped it would be. She looked at him for a long moment. The full attention, the assessment, the thing she did that he had learned was not calculation but was the closest thing she had to allowing herself to be seen looking them. Why father, she said, had a saying about documents that arrived without a covering letter. He said that a document without a covering letter was a document that trusted its contents to speak for themselves. A pause. I always thought that was the more honest approach. He waited. Yes, she said. To the category that doesn't have a name. Yes, that he did not say anything immediately. He was aware that this was the moment when certain people said things, and that he was not certain he had the right things to say. And that she would probably prefer accuracy to adequacy. When the review is concluded, he said, and the estate is restored, there will be a great deal to do. The house needs work. The grounds need work. The mill in Norfolk is apparently still functioning and someone has been using it for 9 years without paying rent. Which is a legal question I haven't yet addressed. That does sound pressing, she said gravely. There is also the archive. He said. The Blackwood family papers. I don't know what survived 9 years of Hartsworth management. I would value assistance from someone with experience in document recovery. That I have some experience in that area, she said. That I know, he said. Your father taught you well, she looked at him. And this time it was not the almost smile. It was the real one, the one he had seen only twice before, once when he had said he would come back. And once when he had said her father deserved to be in the record. It was not large. It was the kind of smile that came from somewhere specific rather than from general social obligation, and it changed her face in a way that he thought about for a long time afterward. That he did. She said. And apparently so did yours. That he stayed for another hour. They worked through the correspondence she had drafted for the other family's solicitors. He made 2 suggestions, she incorporated one and explained with precision why the other would achieve the opposite of the intended effect. And he conceded the point. When he left, she walked him to the door, which she had not done before, because before there had never been a door that was hers to walk him to. On the step, he turned. The category, he said. I've been trying to find a name for it. Have you found one? He considered. Not a single word. Several words that are approximately accurate. Tell me when you have fewer, she said. That he walked to his carriage. He thought, on the way, that she had told him without saying it that she had been trying to name it too. That he found that this was the most useful piece of intelligence he had received in 9 years. 6 months later. The library at Blackwood House had books on its shelves again. Not all of them. The Hartsworth estate sale had dispersed the original collection to half a dozen dealers across London and the South, and recovery was, as Isabella had noted with the precision she brought to all assessments, a long-term project rather than a short-term one. But the shelves were no longer empty. The books that were there had been found one at a time, from dealers and catalogs and, in 3 cases, from neighbors who had purchased them at auction and returned them when they understood the circumstances. Augustus was in the library when he heard the voices in the corridor. He had been reviewing the formal review finding received 5 weeks prior, the attainder reversed, the estate restored. The 1806 proceedings declared procedurally compromised and referred for further action, not because he needed to review it again, but because he had found, unexpectedly, that he sometimes needed to read it in the way that a man sometimes needed to return to a place to confirm it was real. His father's name was in the finding. In the record. Stated clearly, without qualification, the proceedings had been conducted on the basis of manufactured evidence. And the finding of that court was set aside. That he set the document down when he heard Isabella's voice. She was speaking to 2 women he did not recognize. He could hear 3 voices, hers the most precise. He stood and moved toward the door, then stopped. Because she had not indicated that she needed him. And she would indicate if she did. He listened instead. One of the women was asking about documentation. How to obtain records that had been filed in a clerk's archive. How to request access to proceedings that were nominally public but practically inaccessible. Her voice had the quality of Samian, who had been carrying a question for a long time and had found, unexpectedly, the right person to ask. Isabella answered. She answered in the flat precise cadence that Augustus had first heard in a locked room, in the dark, giving him the layout of a house she could not leave. She explained the procedure, the archive access requirements, the specific language that worked and the language that didn't. The name of a solicitor who had a particular interest in cases of this kind. She did not simplify. She did not soften. She gave them what they needed in the form in which they could use it. He stood in the doorway of the library and listened, when the voices moved toward the front of the house. The departure. He went back to the desk and sat down. A few minutes later he heard her footsteps in the corridor, the particular rhythm he had learned from a loose stair in a house that was not hers. She came into the library and looked at him. New cases, he said. Introduced by Lady Grantham, she said. She has been productive. She sat down across from him, and he pushed the finding across the table so she could see it, and she looked at it for a moment in the way she sometimes looked at documents she had already read, not for information. For confirmation. There are 6 cases in progress now, she said. Between your committee and the fund inquiry. She paused. There will be more that I know. She looked at the finding for another moment, and then she looked up at him. Your father's mill, she said. Have you addressed the rent question? I have a meeting with the tenant next week, he said. He's been there for 11 years, apparently. He says he wrote to the estate 3 times and received no response, that he wrote to the Hartsworths. She said, yes. Who had no interest in responding. He paused. He's a good miller. By all accounts. I'm inclined to formalize the arrangement. That seems appropriate, she said. Your father built the mill for the village. He looked at her. How do you know that? It's in the estate survey. She said. The one you brought the second Wednesday. There's a notation in the margin, your father's hand, I think, based on the slope. For the village use. Not the estate. She paused. I meant to mention it. I forgot that. He was quiet for a moment. His father had built a mill for a village and written it in the margin of a survey in handwriting that his daughter-in-law not yet, not formally. But the review was complete and the separation proceedings were concluded, and the category had acquired, over 6 months, something approaching a name had identified from the slope of a letter. He wrote things down. Augustus said that he did. Isabella said. It's a useful habit. He looked at her across the desk at the documents between them, the finding and the case files and the list that had 23 entries and was currently at 31, at the small precise hand in the margins of every document that mattered. At the woman who had been memorizing a paper in a locked room 9 months ago and was now sitting in a library that was slowly filling with recovered books. That he taught you well, he said. She looked at him steadily. You've said that before. It remains accurate. So does this, she said. And pushed the finding back toward him. Read the 3rd paragraph again. Prentice put your father's name in the summary statement. Not a footnote. He looked down at the finding. The 3rd paragraph. His father's name, stated clearly, in the record. Where it would remain. He thought of his father's desk, cleared. The wooden horse on the windowsill. The mill built for the village. The margin note in a survey that a woman with a good eye for handwriting had read and remembered and mentioned, on a Tuesday afternoon. In a library that smelled of old paper and new possibility, as though it were simply a fact worth knowing. Your father would have found this appropriate, he said. The record. His name in it. She was quiet for a moment. That he would have said it was procedurally correct. She said. And then he would have been very pleased. Augustus looked at the finding for another moment, and then he set it in the left-hand position. Primary documents, and picked up the first of the new case files. Tell me about Lady Grantham's introductions. He said. She told him. He listened. Outside, the Norfolk grounds were still overgrown in places. It would take time, she had said, and she was right about most things. But through the library window he could see where the kitchen garden had been cleared and replanted. And at the far edge of the grounds, just visible, the top of the mill, its wheel turning. They worked until the light went.